All right, good afternoon. Want to welcome you to a subject that I'm sure you're not tired of yet, which is the pandemic survival skills. We should have actually, when we were looking at it, probably named it something else because I think everybody's thoroughly over the pandemic in every which direction. But my name is Dwayne Weeks. I'm an executive director at Lake County Schools for their IT department. And then I'll let Ashley introduce herself.
Ashley Rosa, Manager of Student Information Systems in Lake County.
Yeah. And so this would, the crowd would be judged a success if we were in a normal room, but since we're in stadium seating or something like that, I just want to acknowledge the fact that you all seem to be left-handed or something like that because you have lopsided in one room. But what we're going to do is that I think this is we're very appreciative of this opportunity simply because realistically, like y'all been through the same thing we have, and it has been a crazy year and some change. We were just kind of musing about how it's nice to actually get back into an environment in which you can actually see people again and kind of sort of commune with other people. And then of course, more importantly, receive a riveting listing of DOE changes that are coming or something like that. But with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the things that we went through in the pandemic. And actually, I think there's a greater lesson. The pandemic needed to be good for something. Because it definitely wasn't good on my soul. It probably wasn't good on yours either. And to be truthful, we made a lot of progress during this, even despite what we had to deal with. And I think a lot of it has to do with some of the things we put in place before. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about what IT departments were worried about previous to the pandemic. And so if you think back to our life, a year, maybe 2 years ago or something like that. Right now, we would probably been famous. We probably would have been waiting on the latest and greatest as far as things that were going to be changes. We would probably be looking for opportunities to get kind of associated with other districts to be able to figure out problems. And so really when our IT department kind of sort of brainstormed this, what were we worried about? What was the things that kept us up at night? Number one, like I said, was those DOE reporting changes, just those things that we knew were going to have to be implemented. And then I think one of the other things that we did is that just to be honest with you, we've had our student information system at this particular point when the pandemic struck for about 7 years. So we weren't going through a conversion. We had it pretty worked out to some extent. It felt like it had a rhythm, even though there were some changes. And so really we were refining those existing processes. And then I think one of the other things, reports to create at any given minute that were due 5 minutes ago or something like that. And so living that life, we started experimenting with things like Power BI and stuff like that. We just had a whole bunch of ongoing projects. And to be honest with you, I can't say that I hated everything about the pandemic because it forced a little bit of change. And one of the changes that I think is probably the most important is the culture. So I'm going to tell you this, is that if we learned one thing during the pandemic, it's that whatever culture you had that got to deliberate things for 6 months before it made a decision and then implemented it a year later, snapped in half. Because if you remember, at least in our time frame, we literally had 11 days to put together a distance learning plan and figure everything out in a short period of time. And that even ricocheted out throughout the student team. And so luckily, we've been working on our cultural aspects of the things that we felt like needed improving before then. You probably do a lot of these things because these are things that just made it. When you think about the pandemic and that moment in time when it finally happened, when they said school's going to shut down for the fourth quarter, it meant certain things, if you had it in place, were valuable tools. And if they were there, they probably had to be re-engineered a little bit. And if they weren't there, they had to be created like almost instantly. And so one of the things that we had is that we had been working with our data clerks. Of course, the data clerks, I say this, and I'm going to say it again, they're the unsung heroes of any school district, and they're underpaid, and they generate all your funding in a lot of respects as far as the reporting that goes along with that. We had actually started to improve our communication with data clerks, where we basically met with them once a month, and we got them used to that. That might not be news to y'all. 2 years ago, that was news to us, and we just started that process. And so that was a big deal. I'll tell you something else we didn't have is we didn't have administrators that actually understood how FTE worked at all. At all. And it's funny, they had taken some obscure, weird, dark arts school finance course whenever they were getting their master's degree, but it had nothing really to do with the actual FTE process. And so we made them, with the endorsement of our superintendent, go through FTE basics training where we taught them the process from front to back. It was a huge, massive step for us in our culture because it made the schools accountable for their data. And if you get to that point where the schools are accountable for the data, then you have partners to get through these crises with. We also hand count our FTE for survey 2 and 3. Meaning that they come in there, they run a report out of our student information system, they run through other validation processes, they run through the FTE detail report that we turn over to them, and they literally match it line for line. And what that gave us is that really hammered the accountability home, but it also meant that when it came time, when the FTE conditions became much less stable as they were this last year, they were ready to hand count it. They knew the importance of it, and they knew how the process worked. And of course, this led to increased stakeholder participation. We were able to write reports better. And then we even came up with the Survey 5 verification lab, which is a lot of fun and way too long to go through at this particular point. But these processes weren't necessarily very hard, just to show you for a second, and we can definitely share them with y'all at any given point. Basically what they are is that it's us running through and doing things like you would expect people to do in a timely manner. Basically make sure your edits are good. Let's look at anything that has a program number of 999 and make sure. I can tell you, we found money the first couple of years too, right? Money that was left on the table just because of bad data. And then it was also, let's make sure that all these kids that are below 0.5 FTE, let's investigate every kid and see why that is. When the administrators got in on it, for them, I won't say it was fun. That would not be true, actually, for them. But what it was is that I think it opened their eyes a little bit to see how things work. So you're now going to watch an IT director struggle not to hit this menu bar and close this window. So move this, and there you go. All right. So with that said, that brings us to the next piece, because that cultural piece was important. And Ashley's going to talk to you a little bit about the accountability.
Perfect. So with these processes that Dwayne was mentioning, just the data clerks meetings themselves, like Dwayne said, we met probably twice a year, face-to-face, around survey time. So having these meetings almost in a monthly and sometimes twice a month, we have these meetings where they are level specific. So we meet with our high schools in the morning, then our middle schools right before lunch, and our elementary schools in the afternoon. We lay out this calendar completely at the beginning of the year, so everyone knows when the meetings are. And then we can also invite other stakeholder groups. HR sometimes attends our meetings. We have college and career readiness, and then ELL and the ESE departments. So we found this to be a really great way to disseminate information strategically and also be able to provide resources. The other cool thing that happens with our data clerk meetings is that we use Google Meet. And so anything that the data clerks are experiencing at the school, they kind of put in the chat, and we can either solve the problem with them during the meeting, or we can kind of bring that information back to our department, work with the appropriate stakeholders. Sometimes those things go to Dwayne and up to executive cabinet. So we were really happy to be able to have the data clerk meeting calendar, have those meetings laid out, and then have participation from other stakeholder groups. So that helps us with the accountability. As you guys know, in the IT department, we house the data, we send the data to the state, but we don't always know every single piece of the data. So having the stakeholder groups, the federal programs department, the ESE department, HR and things like that really kind of brings the communication full circle, and we're able to work as teams across the district. And then that information kind of circles up and down, and then kind of across all levels. So the data clerk meetings have been a really big improvement in our processes. I think I'm going to struggle. All right. Perfect. Thank you. And then, like Dwayne mentioned, the survey 2 and 3 verification labs, those labs were really helpful because as we developed the custom reports, we work with our programming department and our programmers, and this process actually helped us to be able to learn our data better. And in the labs, we were able to facilitate the schools. We had administrators sitting side by side with data clerks, hand counting the FTE, which they were asking questions and probably things that wouldn't have happened happened prior to having a lab were happening in this lab because we had the administrators side by side with the data clerks, and we had them actually in the system looking at, things that may just be left to the data clerk to figure out on their own. Administrator for solving problems and working side by side in those pieces. So like Dwayne said, we're happy to share this lab with you. It has kind of evolved over time with different areas and different formats that we've added into the process.
So I think one of the key things that we learned is that these tools, like I said, that were basically available to us like they really did help us a lot whenever the pandemic struck. And so if we would not have had this culture of accountability, and she mentioned something that I think is so super key. The vice principal, the assistant principal, the principal, whoever the school-based administrator is sitting next to the data clerk. It is not the data clerk reconciling the FTE. Every principal is required to sign off on it. The reason why that's important is that when they sign off on it, they own it. Because let's be real, it's unfair if you've got a big major data problem to go to the data clerk and go, you're accountable for this, because they're accountable for all kinds of things. Like we had a data clerk one time doing lice checks. That's a new job. There's probably other duties as assigned to some extent, but it's like hard to see somebody being put through all that necessarily, and then also being responsible for all that school's funding. It needed to be an administrator. And let's be real too, the scheduling administrator is impacting a lot there in student course and teacher course on what's actually getting sent to the state. So realistically, they should have their hand on it. So that accountability was a big deal. So let's talk about when the pandemic struck. So the spring of 2020, one of the things that we did, we were actually kind of like, one of those things you're laughing about a little bit is that in February, I took a trip to Philadelphia. And this trip to Philadelphia, there was a news story about coronavirus that I watched at the airport. I was like, that sounds unlikely. And then whenever it happened, by March, I sat on a call that I think went something along the lines of like, we will absolutely not shut school down. To be followed by a call 2 days later that we are absolutely shutting school down. And then we went on spring break just by the nature of the way our calendar works. So literally like that happened on a Friday and we went on spring break. And so everybody got away and nobody really knew what to do. The good news is that if I go back to the spring of 2020, really, that's that sweet spot post survey 3, right? It's like you got past survey 2 and you worked out most of your changes. Survey 3 doesn't feel nearly as the burden, right? And we're like, things are looking pretty good. By the way, too, it was also Ashley's first year.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, last year was my first year. So it's been a party. But I guess the thing I was going to say is that what we did is that the school years could end basically using their existing processes. We had that year and not really much had changed. School just stopped. We had started into a total distance learning mode. The other side of our shop had to ship out 20,000 Chromebooks in about 3 weeks. That was fun too. But I guess the thing I was going to say is for the most part, like we just did in school. But I'm going to tell you, it's like one of those weird minutes where you're like, man, I got through it. And the summer was 10 times worse because then all of a sudden there was all this free will put in. The governor had said a couple things, we're going back to school, but how you go back to school is up to the local authority. I don't know about you, we had like a 10-hour school board meeting on how we were going to go back, followed by umpteen million hours working on a reopening plan, followed by, I don't even know how much gnashing and wailing of teeth by the public who either liked the plan, didn't like the plan, were terrified of masks, wanted a mask, whatever. Like all those considerations made it much muddier, right? And so when we talk about it, like relearning it's like you get through this crisis and then you have to relearn how to adjust again real fast because it had a totally different feel. Schedule changes. We thought we were going to outschedule the virus. It was honestly the dumbest idea I'd ever heard in my life, but I couldn't say anything at the time. We thought a block schedule would mean the kids would pass less. But if you've ever gone to a block schedule or then back from a block schedule, it's a lot of work. And by the way, this is happening in the summer when your schedule should be mostly ready, right? And so it sounded like a good idea, but it definitely was a bit of a barrier, if I'm being truthful. And then to make it even weirder to some extent, these late decision points, because everything was kind of sort of deliberated in front of the public, put a challenge on us that we weren't quite really ready for. And so they had asked us at the very, very end, they're like, y'all good for the start of school? I'm like, I have no idea, right? So in fall of 2020, like our virtual school did what yours did in a mushroom cloud-like fashion, exploded. And ours went from like really more closer to 200 or something like that to 5,000 students. By the way, our virtual school was staffed the way your virtual school was, poorly, meaning that they had like 3 or 4 people, it seemed like, working there. And then all of a sudden they're supposed to register 5,000 students, right? And so we had to set up like a small factory in the back of one of our portables where people were registering. It looked like something out of Willy Wonka, where people were just like working and working and working on registrations. Then Survey 6 came. Survey 6 was hilarious because we started a week late, so we missed the first window for Survey 6. But we got the second one, and we looked at our head counts, and we're like, we're all going to die when we saw Survey 6. And keeping in mind, Survey 6 is after kids have shown up, right? Like this is starting to become a post-mortem to some extent, right? And so what ended up happening is that we found at that particular point, kids are now, there were some students that appeared to be missing. We've noticed the state looks like they've joined the hunt in finding those missing kids a year later. But nonetheless, like it's one of those things that definitely was on our thing, because what we saw coming, and maybe we thought about the kids, of course, to some extent, and all the displacement caused by the pandemic. But what we saw is Survey 2 was going to be a bloodbath financially. Like we had already started running numbers, and we had already started looking at some analytics, and it did not feel good. So all you have to do when you have this thing is that luckily we felt like we had, if I'm just to sort of start painting the story and turning it back the other way here for a second, we felt like we had the culture, like people were definitely team-minded and they were working with us. And I know even that was getting a little stretched as we started opening schools. We definitely had the accountability in. Those principals were nervous. They were calling us about their FTE. Going, what are we going to do if our FTE is this low? And they knew, because FTE ultimately to a principal means allocations, right? And so they see people, and they had already had all the shifting. By the way, too, remember we had an innovative learning option, which I'm not sure was either. And I guess the thing is that like we ended up doing that hybrid model. So that was another thing to go through. So the only thing we could do is force a bunch of needed, necessary for survival improvement, which is what I guess you're going to talk about, or we both?
All right, perfect. So one of the first things we did is just started digging into the data a little bit deeper. And we noticed that prior to the pandemic happening, we had a really great starting point of data. So Survey 3, kind of our data was good to go in 2019. So we really used that as a starting point. Where were the students in Survey 3 of 2019? And we used that and worked with our growth planning department to compare those students to students that we found an enrollment record for Survey 2. So creating that report was a really big important piece in us knowing where students were going to show up and locating those students that may have not yet enrolled. So that zoned school report, comparing it to pre-pandemic data, kind of led us on the hunt to find those missing students early on. The other thing we did is because we had that school culture of accountability, we had a webinar where we basically disseminated this report and gave that list to school teams for them to work and locate their students that were zoned to them. So we really felt this was a great way to locate students that may not have shown up in the fall yet, because we were looking at where they were prior to the pandemic, and then asking the school to locate them if the student had not yet enrolled. So I don't know if you want to talk about the work with student services.
Yeah. So I think one of the things to me that was absolutely key on this, and this was crazy, right? Like, so I don't know about you, like maybe the district is one happy family or something like that, like to some extent, but like in our district, like any other district, we have some silos, right? And so like one of the things that's always a challenge is when you have this siloed work, like in a pandemic and an emergency, like you'll die by those silos. And one of the silos that we honestly had is that we had a silo potentially with the people who did growth planning. We have a growth planning department that helps us figure out where we're zoning kids and everybody else, right? And so I got to kind of sort of home in on the brilliance of what Ashley's team did. And honestly, like this is pretty amazing to some extent. So we knew who was here in Survey 3, right? Like that was all good. Like we had packaged that data, we had sent it. And if you think about where we were when the pandemic struck, we were getting ready to start scheduling for next year, right? And this goes to show you how during a crisis, if IT departments can be agile, they can use anything as a weapon, right? And you probably know that anyway to some extent, right? And so we have this zone school. So one of the things we do is we have a dependent system, basically, that figures out where kids are going to go next year. Then we shove it into our student information system. A lot of districts have that. Some districts it does it in it, but like, or some student information systems it does it in it. But that was a silo. Like we hadn't really talked to those people except to get the file. And there's a lot of probably departments where that's your main function or interface with them, right? You get the file and then you put the file in and then they figure it out, right? But by getting that zone student, we were able to sit there and then bang it up against who was actually enrolled. So it's like pre-pandemic, you knew where everybody was going because everything had got scrambled. You had 5,000 kids go to virtual that weren't there anymore, right? And so you got to, in all these transactions, keep up with them. But by taking that file and then matching it to our enrollment file, we got a list of an efficient list for the schools that we had a webinar. And I'm not gonna lie, they probably cussed us a little bit during the webinar, to be honest with you, because about the 4th or 5th time we've had to go to them, mainly because of their dumb scheduling thing. But I guess what I was gonna say is that like, it was fascinating because like we gave them a list and they made the calls. You know how many kids we recovered? Like what's funny is that I don't know what the guidance is gonna look like from the DOE on finding missing students. We already found them. Like in fact, just to kind of sort of reflect it, by survey 2, the DOE gave us a call and they were kind of like, hey, something's wrong with your FTE. And we're like, oh God, here it comes, right? Like, cause you know, probably. And we had kind of a quiet call, the superintendent kind of a quiet call and they're like, yeah, they think we're too high compared to what other districts are saying. And we're like, we'll take it. So like hang up the phone. It's like, let it go. And of course, eventually it evened out because I think a lot of other districts caught up. But the thing is that we felt like we went from in survey 6, we're on fire, to at the very, very end, we felt like those principals found those kids. Those kids weren't coming back to school, a lot of them for the record. Like, or they were going to homeschool without any kind of process or anything like that. There was just all kinds of squirreliness. And so like, we feel pretty good about that. And I think it goes to show you how clever IT departments can be when they're just not constrained with any kind of old thought behind it where you're like, well, it's going to take a whole lot of time to do it. Listen, we all survived this pandemic. We were all doing things in rapid fashion. And so like, when I think about it for a second, then the key part was that previous cultural or accountability piece. Then when it came time for survey 2, I'm not talking about y'all because y'all probably figured it out. But for us, if this would have happened 3 years ago, we did not have that hand validation of FTE. And I don't know anything that would have been scarier in this blizzard of craziness than to send that data to the state and just hope the FTE number is kind of close, right? Without that hand counting. And so the reason why I bring it up is these good processes make you more pandemic proof or whatever the next emergency is. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Not what the next emergency is. I don't think it's scheduled or anything like that. I could be, who knows? So,
so a couple of things on this previous slide that Dwayne mentioned, in the midst of looking at where students were zoned and hadn't showed up yet for survey 2, we also created with our programming team the missing schedules report. So we had some issues with data entry. You know, students were being enrolled, but maybe they weren't given a full schedule and things like that. So we worked on the missing schedule report and then also the lovely location of student data element that came out. We created a specific report for innovative learning, that innovative learning student location, and then the blended learning. So both of those reports we fed into our FTE validation process that we had established prior to the pandemic. And so we just kind of added on to that generic process that we had where we were validating FTE. We brought the additional reports in, and we also had schools and administrators validating those new data elements in the midst of the craziness of survey 2. So because we had the FTE validation process already in place, it was easy to add in some of the additional pieces that we needed because of the pandemic. So we added in the missing schedules report and then the location of student into the process. And again, this just had a great effect on us feeling confident in the data we were sending, and then also having the schools validate that the data was correct for their students. As you guys know, we sit in the IT department. We don't know, what students show up or what services they receive. It's really the schools and that need to validate the data. So this was just one more piece in us feeling good about what we're sending for survey that is accurate and complete.
So I think one of the things is that like, as we kind of sort of talked a little bit about this, like, I think as you can see, we've done a lot, but here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you, and I'll time you just to make sure that we stay on track to some extent. I'd like you to take like 3 minutes and then turn and talk to your neighbor, which we've not been able to do in a year and a half because you would have infected them. But now you hopefully won't. And I guess the thing is that if you do, that's between y'all. But like, I guess the thing I would like you to do is I'd like to hear some feedback from the group of because we did stuff and y'all did stuff. Everybody's a hero in this room because you still are here, right? So my question is that talk with one of your neighbors or two of your neighbors, like what did you do during the pandemic when you might have seen like student counselor or in regards to student data, you'd be creative on it, but like what did you do in regards to this or maybe even other aspects of the pandemic? So take 3 minutes and go.
If you do, I'll get up and I'll grab this mic so that they can be heard.
Oh, okay. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna probably have a couple of minutes.
Excellent. The only thing I want to mention is that for any questions, again,
Yeah, so that's a good question. Okay. We're doing good. Sorry, I think it's the first.
Oh. It's okay. Here is
Oh, right. So this is pretty good.
Yep.
So, see the mic? Who's this? Is it called Slack? Sit.
We'll sit.
All right, we're going to go ahead and come back together. And what we'd like to do is, because I know y'all like sharing out, because I love sharing. What we're going to do is we're going to have the young man over here come up to you. Who would like to kind of sort of share something you did that maybe it's not been included or whatever you want to say. If you want to freestyle rap, feel free. Liz first. so I have really good wait time too.
Uh-oh.
We got 15 minutes. Oh, come on. Okay, so there's somebody. Good.
The mic is coming your way.
We have open labs for all throughout the year for different processes with our clerks and things, but we also have some of the trainings that are mandatory, like for the FTE and stuff. We have open labs for scheduling, for the for FTE, and so that they can come in and work on their things, get away from the school, get away from all the distractions, come in, bring them to work with them, and actually sit down. Now, we were limited some this last year with how many people we got under the so we had to distance people. So we started doing a lot more virtual trainings and things and putting them out there so that they could play them as their own case or when they had time to be able to do that.
Very good.
Probably a lot of things that everybody else did.
Yeah, but still very good. Let me ask you this. How many of you sort of went into the foray of like the first time doing the virtual like communications with your data entry clerks or administrators during the pandemic? Like raise your hand real quick. Yeah. How many of you are going to?
We did. We had taught that and assessed it and tried it all the time, but this is forced.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was us too.
Yeah.
Because like previously to me, if you would ask me like, hey, is virtual going to work? I'm going to be like, I don't know. Like to be truthful, I think we will continue to use it in our toolkit as we go forward because like it, not for everything. I'm looking forward to seeing them face to face. I really am. But for some things, when you're trying to do that quick hit of information that came fast and we need to get it out there, it's so much better than an email or something like that because that chance to interact and ask questions and stuff like that. And we've gotten a lot of feedback on that. So good. So let's talk about agility for a second, because I feel like that's now what this is kind of all leading to. And so again, kind of looking at it in spring of 2021, here's the good news is that like most of our students have returned to our brick and mortar schools. I'm going to put a pin on that brick and mortar piece because the pandemic's over-ish, if you get what I'm saying, because survey 4 is going on right now, and that virtual school that exploded in enrollment now has to be reconciled in survey 4. And I don't know about you, like that part has had us nervous to some extent. In survey 3, one of the things that we looked at is we looked at actually adding ESC to the FTE verification process. I'm going to tell you, ESC felt a little bit like a blind spot during the pandemic. If you think about the delivery of services, if you think about IEPs and stuff like that got a little weird for a minute, right? And so even though it was on our roadmap to go ahead and expand that, we went ahead and did. But probably one of the things that we learned is that any tool, like I said, can be used. And so for survey 4, one of the things we started doing is and you'll probably know which student information system we use when we say this, have a file known as the maintain file. And in the maintain file, basically it's a part of the file that we send to the state. And one of the things that we started looking at is we saw survey 4, just like we saw survey 6. Survey 6, I think one thing we learned during the pandemic is if their check engine light is on in your student data, you can't keep like just going thinking nothing's going to happen. Like it's a warning light to some extent, right? And we started to see some early indications, even honestly, if we hadn't seen metrics, it would just be the size of survey 4 compared to past years, right? Knowing that had not basically like that staff had not really grown that much. And so one of the things that we started doing is we started looking at any tool available. And so this particular tool was we take the maintain file, which is what we ship to the state. And that's the data kind of in its rawest sense to some extent. And what we do is we take the parts that we want, and we actually had a survey 4 dashboard that we built for our virtual school using Google Data Studio. And it takes a minute because it's a massive file. But basically what it does is that if you've ever done the virtual school game, you know how much fun IPs are. If you know what I'm talking about, is those in progresses, which are basically rejects. And really, if you're not careful, that is money that you are going to leave on the table. And if we ever go drinking together, I'll tell you how I know that story really well and why my district was probably responsible for the IP rule. Like it's actually kind of a thing. But the thing is that with that said, one of the things that we built in this is that we basically built like we needed to monitor, and more importantly, we needed virtual to monitor as they were doing. So what we do is we refresh this dashboard about once a week, and now it's much more frequent. But what you can see is that we basically built this dashboard out to where it says, this is the number of files right now that have an IP. And so in that yellow, that's what yellow means, right? Is that it's in danger. There's a caution there. And as you can see, we're trying to get to the magic number of 80% to not have a rejected file. And then in the green, what you can see is these are things that actually have a grade associated with them. And then I hate to say it, outside the data set, and it provides us analytics that are important. Listen, there's an instructional component to this too, right? It's like how many kids actually completed, how many kids actually got a decent grade out of it. And honestly, we will probably be cleaning up the instructional impact of this pandemic for years, right? But we also saw the number of courses that aren't going to receive because the student didn't pass. And as you can see, this number, we provided this number to leadership very early because nobody likes a surprise of, oops, we're short $4 million off grades if they don't know ahead of time. And so basically, we've plugged leadership into this. We've plugged the virtual school into it. The virtual school can see their data entry, make the needle move in the right direction, and we're all in sync. Again, building that basic culture of accountability and us all working together. Now, right now, outside of Ashley's office, there's probably 4 to 5 people from virtual feverishly working on entering the grades, and we will provide them an update in the next day or so as survey 4 progresses. But we have found this dashboard to be pretty revolutionary. And I think what it is that it's just representative of what districts can do when they decide to be a little bit more innovative. One of the other things we came up with is that we actually had this in the plan, but I'm gonna tell you, getting our people ready for scheduling is tough. How many of you started school in an elementary school? Probably most likely, because really all kinds of chaos and disorder explode in immediate, like a middle school or a high school. How many of you had an elementary school start where they got it on paper, but they don't have it in the system, right? Pretty much almost a lot of people. And so what we started putting in is we started putting in future scheduling progress checks. And so we designed this to basically in June, building that accountability. They have to self-report. Of course, we can look too, but they self-report where they are. We can see which schools need help and then adjust, because it kind of sort of produces a nice report. But all kinds of important things like, are you looking at class size right now? Do you have the master schedule finished? Do you have students scheduled? What percentage, things of that nature are all there. And so I think that's been very, very instrumental. And then probably, I will say this just real quick last. Oops, now this is in the way again. So we'll move it. Is that Survey 5 validation lab, we basically included some of the new additional FTE elements. So I guess as we get to it and kind of sort of finish it up, I think the most important thing is that like it really is a cycle, right? And we think that even though this was a major problem, this is the opportunity for us to solve every problem with it. Listen, if you've got the culture that basically increases those school-based teams' capacity and then builds bridges between leaderships. I sit in a lot of long meetings with the executive cabinet and leadership. And part of what those meetings allow me to do is they allow me to bring things back. So that first bridge we build is to leadership. Nothing really comes as a surprise. And then probably more importantly, Ashley does a great job of building that relationship with the school-based teams. And so I think that's important. And then the improvement piece is, listen, I don't know if we ever have a quiet time anymore. Like, I don't know if that exists, but it is starting to feel a little more quiet than it was this time last year. It's a little bit, right? And so I think one of the things is that we can never take the quiet time for granted. I know you're probably thinking, Dwayne, when do I get to take a vacation? The answer is never. But realistically, like these quiet times are important for us to keep continuously refining these processes. And then I think the accountability is important too, which is really the second step, which is like that engage stakeholders. It's kind of a cycle. Listen, if you got the culture, you can engage the stakeholders. If the stakeholders feel they're responsible for it, you can get the improvement and then just keep it going. When the improvement is there, then the culture is there. And then I'm going to kind of turn it over to Ashley to kind of sort of explain a little bit about like how she's built such a good culture with the data clerks.
So I think it really is just that team-based approach. When we have our data clerk meetings and when we meet with them, it really is us sharing the information we have with them, but then them also sharing the information and what they're experiencing at the school sites. So it's really just that back and forth communication. If they're running into an issue and there's something that we can do in the system to make their life easier, we'll definitely do it. If there's a report needed that, that could help them work more efficiently, we get with our report writing team. We work really closely with our instructional technology facilitators. So I think it's just being available and being wanting to work as a team, creating that environment where they feel comfortable approaching and asking, for help when they need it, and also us listening to the needs that they have and providing resources as we can. So like Dwayne said, our data clerks are some of the hardest working people in the district, and we're happy to support them. It's like, so it's an honor to work with them because they do work so hard and generate all of our funding for the district. So we learn from them just as much as they learn from us. So I think that is the biggest key in supporting the schools is making sure the student information system it works for them as well. Whenever they have a need, that we try to fulfill that need to the best that we can.
So given your raucous response to the sharing time, maybe you're going to answer, maybe you're not going to answer. But I guess the thing is, the next thing we'd like to do is any questions you would have had for us. I will say this is that the gentleman with the microphone kind of sort of comes over. Like, I don't think we were unique to some extent. I think everybody's got their own story in this entire thing. But I do think our team was exceptionally dedicated. And like I said, I can't thank them enough for all the work that they've done. So any questions?
My question has to do with the staff funds. So who created them and how?
It was David Haston. He's available for consulting shortly after this meeting. Yeah, he is amazing. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. So our district is starting to take the philosophy that if we're running paper reports, we're running dead weight to some extent. Like even reports that you run out of the system are like it's got to tell a story, right? Like, and so David he works in our instructional technology side. We found Data Studio, Google Data Studio. If you're a Google district, it's free, it's available, it's very powerful to a large extent. Doesn't quite have all the neat things that Power BI has as far as being able to hook into the database directly. You have to push stuff to it. But even in pushing stuff, there's some value to it. It's like you control the refresh rate. You know what I'm saying? And so there's a little bit of value in that too. But yeah, like I think it's one of those things that I'm going to tell you when I present it to cabinet, if I present them with a report, it's either old or they look at the format of the report and they don't get it. This is like bright green. I'm not trying to say they're simple-minded, but like bright green, bright red, bright yellow. It's very easy to digest. And I think that's super key. We've gotten away, I'm not saying we're there yet, we got a ways to go. We've gotten away from our new reports that we think have a lot of high value of just trying to write reports, and also trying to write reports in which we have this front end on it where we can present people, because ultimately you got to do something with the data. And that's kind of our key. So yeah, but that investment is paid off in spades. Like I'm going to tell you flat out. What's neat about his dashboard is that we got it disabled in this particular case, but you can actually look up students in the Survey 4 dashboard. So if you've got a question about like it living in the Florida virtual system over there on the side, and you need to go look and see if it's in the maintain file, you can very quickly look up that student, see that student's schedule record, and see if the grades have been entered. So it's even transcended just a report or a dashboard is a way to fix the problem, if that makes sense. Like I said, about 100 an hour, I think, is what he's asking for. So I get 10%. So yes, hi. Oh, I'm sorry. Like, yeah, I didn't even know you were over there because they were asking. No, I'm just kidding. Amen.
There you go.
There you go. Gotcha. 42 and F, as I leave this meeting tomorrow, 43, because we'll get the certificate of occupancy on one, about 43,000 students or so.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was curious about the hand talent and things like
Yeah.
that. In Orange County Public Schools, we have 261 schools.
For sure. But I'm going to tell you, I can't tell you like how many tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars we found. Like, I'm just like, it's crazy, like stuff that was just being left on the table. And I tell you, more than importantly than the money's important, obviously, I get to sleep at night knowing it's certified. Like the principal signed it and said, and they hand counted it. And I tell you, that peace of mind during the pandemic or any just normal year is huge. So like, it would be a huge undertaking for sure for Orange, but I definitely think, I mean, you don't even, like, it's scary. The first year you look, you're like, oh my God, what am I going to find? Like, did we like lose millions of dollars every year?
Well, but the good stuff, we'll say this, like our state reporting team, it's a whole team.
Yeah, gotcha.
You know, like they go down and we have twice weekly meetings.
Sure.
Hours for each of the various different areas. So they're able to really drill down and then report it out to the schools and like, hey, you need to take a look at this, you know.
Yeah, that's amazing. I will tell you the benefit. That's amazing that if you've got a state reporting team that can do that hard drill, that's great. I'll tell you where we got a little extra pop that was maybe somewhat not unintended, but whatever. It really is when the schools own the data, when they're hand counting basically the sort of fruits of their work to some extent, that quality of that data goes up a lot. That is correct. And I tell you, a principal's signature will get you a long way there. Like it will, for sure.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, like with our in our verification labs, we typically have them come in by grade level. So we'll bring elementary schools in and kind of do 10 at a time. And then after probably the first couple labs, the first lab we did took a while, but our elementary schools, they have, below 1,000 students. They can get through that lab process in about an hour and a half. We have high schools that have, over 2,000 students, and they do take longer. They end up migrating to different parts of IT to finish the validation. But I think it just brings like what we get out of that process, having administrators work side by side. I think, and the principals, the thing we were laughing about is that the principals like left those labs saying, thank you. Like, they're like, thank you so much. Like, now I understand. Thank you so much. Like, I feel good about my FTE. And so like, I was like, Dwayne, they're thanking us. So we didn't necessarily expect that, you know, we wanted to sleep at night, obviously sending the appropriate data to the state, but the fact that they saw benefit in it, I think, you know, every time we call them in, they're, you know, I don't know, happy to come, but they come and they do what we ask them to do. So.
All right. So listen, we really appreciate the time we got to spend with y'all, and hope y'all have a good rest of the conference. And like I said, $100 an hour. Good. So.